It was late November, and I was on the night shift, patrolling a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing ever happened here, so when the radio crackled with a call about a disturbance, my partner and I exchanged surprised glances. A neighbor had reported hearing screams, sudden and intense, coming from a house that had always seemed perfectly normal. But what disturbed me more was what followed. The eerie, heavy silence, as if the house had swallowed the noise and refused to let anything escape. I remember the chill that ran down my spine as we pulled up to the house. It wasn't the weather. The night was mild for November. No, this was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The house stood there, wrapped in shadows that seemed unnaturally thick, almost like a blanket of darkness that the streetlights couldn't pierce. I glanced at my partner, who was a seasoned officer, a guy who had seen it all. But even he looked uneasy, his jaw set tight as he stepped out of the car. We approached the house cautiously, my heart thudding louder with every step. I rapped my knuckles on the front door, a standard knock. Silence. I knocked again, harder this time, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Still nothing. I could feel my pulse quicken as I glanced at my partner. He nodded, and we reached for our guns, pushing the door open. It creaked, swinging inward slowly, almost as if it was inviting us in. I'll never forget that moment. The way the darkness seemed to seep out, as though the house was exhaling, welcoming us into its cold, suffocating embrace. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Thick, damp, like something had been rotting for a while. It was the kind of stench that made you want to gag, but we pushed on, flashlights cutting through the gloom. "Police!" I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls, only to be swallowed by the silence. We stepped further inside, my hand trembling as I gripped my flashlight tighter. Everything felt wrong. The furniture was overturned, picture frames were shattered on the floor, and there was a thick layer of dust on everything, like the place had been abandoned for years, though we knew it hadn't been. We moved through the house, room by room, trying to piece together what had happened. Each step felt heavier than the last, like something was trying to hold us back, keep us from discovering the truth. My partner kept glancing over his shoulder, his face pale and taut, and I knew he felt it too. The sense of being watched, the prickling sensation at the back of your neck when someone's eyes are boring into you, but you can't see them. As we climbed the stairs, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely more than a murmur, coming from the room at the end of the hall. I stopped, straining to hear, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had come. My partner had heard it too. I could see it in his eyes, the flash of fear. We continued forward, every nerve screaming at me to turn back, to run. But we had to know. We had to find out what had happened in that house. We reached the door, and my hand hesitated on the knob. My mouth was dry, and I could feel my heart pounding against my rib cage. I pushed the door open, and my flashlight illuminated a child's bedroom. It was pristine, untouched by the chaos that had consumed the rest of the house. Toys were neatly arranged, a tiny bed was made with care, and a rocking horse stood by the window, its faded paint chipping away, as if it had been sitting there for decades. But what froze me in place was that the horse was gently rocking back and forth, even though there was no breeze, no reason for it to move. The whispering started again, louder this time, swirling around us, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized it wasn't a single voice. It was many, overlapping, blending together into something that made my skin crawl. I could barely make out the words, but they were there, just below the surface, like a secret you weren't supposed to hear. My partner's hand was on his gun, and I could see his knuckles turning white. "Do you see that?" he whispered, and I turned to where he was pointing. At first I didn't see anything, but then, slowly, shapes began to emerge in the darkness, like shadows peeling away from the walls. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Faces, pale, distorted faces, staring at us from the corners of the room, their eyes dark and hollow, mouths twisted into silent screams. The rocking horse began to pick up speed, creaking as it moved, and the whispering grew louder, almost deafening. I could barely think, barely breathe, as the room seemed to close in around us, and then, as if on cue, the whispers turned into a scream, a blood-curdling, inhuman wail that made my ears ring and my vision blur. The walls seemed to vibrate, and I could feel the floor shaking beneath my feet. "Let's go," my partner shouted, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the rocking horse, which was now rocking violently, almost tipping over with each swing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The rocking horse stilled, the whispering cut off, and the room was plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence. We bolted. I don't even remember making it down the stairs, just the sensation of running, my feet barely touching the ground as we burst out the front door and into the cold night air. We didn't stop until we were back in the car, breathing heavily, our hands shaking. We didn't speak, not to each other, not to anyone. There was nothing to say, nothing that could explain what we had just experienced. I don't know what was in that house, and I don't want to know. I haven't set foot on that street since, and every time I drive by, I make sure to keep my eyes forward, not looking at the house that still sits there, dark and silent, like a black hole sucking in the light around it. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I think I can still hear it. The whispering, faint and distant, calling to me, reminding me that some things are better left forgotten. The sirens wailed as our patrol car rolled down the gravel driveway, the night swallowing the sound as quickly as it was produced. The asylum, a monolithic shadow against the pale moonlight, loomed before us. We'd been called out here for a noise complaint, rumors of trespassers, maybe some thrill-seeking kids. But even as I radioed into dispatch, I couldn't shake the feeling that this place was more than just a crumbling building. It was something alive. I cut the engine, and the silence that followed was suffocating. My partner, Mike, gave me a wary glance, his hand resting uneasily on his flashlight. "Just kids, right?" he muttered, almost as if he needed to hear it said out loud. "Or squatters," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's just check it out, and head back." We got out, the gravel crunching underfoot, and approached the rusted iron gate. It was overgrown with weeds, twisted like something out of a nightmare. Mike pushed it, and the gate groaned open, the sound echoing into the darkness like a warning. For a moment I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, but I wasn't about to admit it, especially not to Mike. We clicked on our flashlights and stepped through. The asylum towered above us, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching our every move. The facade was crumbling, the paint peeling, and I could swear I saw shadows flickering in the corners of the windows. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, the kind that clings to your clothes and sticks to your skin. We moved forward, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply, and the stench of rot hit me like a punch to the gut. The hallways were narrow, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and broken glass. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, and every step felt like it was leading us deeper into something that didn't want us there. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand on end, and the silence was heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. We started our sweep, checking room by room, calling out but getting no answer. Every so often I'd hear something, like a whisper or a faint shuffle, but when I'd turn, there'd be nothing. Mike was quiet, which wasn't like him. He was usually cracking jokes even on the grimmest calls, but now he was as tense as I'd ever seen him. We reached the main common area. A lone wheelchair sat in the middle, rusted and old. I walked over, shining my light on it. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and yet there it was, right in the middle of the room, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. I reached out to move it, but the moment my hand touched the metal, the wheelchair rolled backward, as if yanked by an invisible hand. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding, and looked at Mike. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, but I had no answer. We scanned the room, the beams of our flashlights darting around like we were trying to catch something in the dark, but there was nothing there. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to sound confident, but my voice came out shaky. We needed to finish this, and fast. We continued down the hall, past room after room, until we reached the solitary confinement wing. The air felt different here, colder, heavier. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my chest, and I knew Mike could hear it too. The hallway stretched out before us, the cells lining each side. Each one was sealed with a heavy metal door, a small barred window at eye level. As we walked, a sound reached us, a faint, scratching noise. I stopped, my flashlight aimed straight ahead, and strained to hear. There it was again, like nails dragging slowly across a chalkboard. We followed the sound to the last cell at the end of the hallway. My heart was hammering now, and every instinct screamed at me to turn around and get out. But I forced myself to move forward. I reached the cell door and peered through the small window, the darkness inside, impenetrable. I couldn't see anything, but the scratching continued, slow and deliberate. "What do you see?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I pressed my face close to the bars, trying to make out anything in the gloom. That's when I saw them, a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at me. They blinked, slow and deliberate, and I could feel them boring into me, like they could see right through me. A low, guttural growl came from the darkness, and I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The light spun as it hit the floor, casting wild, erratic shadows across the walls. I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking, and when I finally managed to aim it at the cell again, the eyes were gone. The scratching had stopped. The growl had faded, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I turned to Mike, my mouth dry, but he was already backing away, his face pale. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." We didn't waste another second. We turned and ran, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted down the hallway. I could hear my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop until we burst through the front doors and out into the night. We didn't speak as we got back in the patrol car, didn't look at each other. I started the engine, my hands shaking, and sped down the driveway, leaving the asylum behind. But as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, just once, and I saw them, those same red eyes, staring out at us from one of the upper windows, unblinking, as if they were watching us leave. I haven't been back to that place since, and I don't plan to. Whatever's in there, it can stay there. But every now and then on a quiet night, I'll hear that same low growl just at the edge of my hearing, and I'll see those eyes, just for a moment, in the dark corners of my mind, and I'll remember what it felt like to have something look at me not like it was seeing me, but like it was choosing me. Patrolling the desolate stretch of highway was supposed to be a monotonous task, but tonight was different. I'm Officer Michael Turner, and as I cruised down the long, empty road, the silence was almost oppressive. The engine hummed beneath me like a slumbering beast, and the darkness outside my cruiser felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. Only the occasional crackle of the radio broke the stillness, the voices of my fellow officers sounding distant and far away. As I rounded a bend, my headlights sliced through the gloom, and suddenly something caught my eye. A figure stood on the shoulder, just outside the reach of my headlights. I squinted, my heart beginning to race. It was a woman, her long white dress fluttering slightly in the cool night breeze. She appeared to be in distress. Her shoulders hunched, her head bowed low. A chill ran down my spine. I slowed the cruiser, the tires crunching softly on the gravel as I brought the vehicle to a stop behind her. My emergency lights flickered to life, casting a pulsating glow over the scene, blue and red swirling in the darkness, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I called out, my voice echoing into the stillness. The woman didn't respond, remaining motionless, her back turned toward me. "Ma'am?" I tried again, stepping out of the cruiser, my hand instinctively resting on my holster. As I approached, a sense of unease washed over me. There was something strange about her. The white dress, while seemingly bright, absorbed the light from my cruiser, leaving her surrounded by an unnatural darkness. I took a cautious step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around and show me your hands," I said, my voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. Slowly, agonizingly so, she began to turn. Time seemed to stretch as I braced myself. What was I going to find? My mind raced through possibilities. Was she injured? Was this some kind of prank? As her face came into view, I stumbled back, gasping. Her skin was pale and gaunt, her eyes nothing but hollow sockets that seemed to stare right through me. Her mouth was agape in a silent scream, revealing rows of jagged, pointed teeth. Terror seized me, and I instinctively reached for my weapon, my fingers trembling. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself, backing away. But before I could react, she vanished. One moment she was there, the next, there was nothing but the empty highway and the chill of the night. I stood, frozen, heart racing, breath catching in my throat. I swung my flashlight around, desperately searching for any sign of her. The highway was silent, save for the distant rustle of leaves. I was utterly alone. The surrealness of the encounter crashed over me in waves. I returned to my cruiser, hands shaking as I fumbled with the radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Turner. I need backup immediately." I struggled to keep my voice steady. "I just encountered a woman on the highway. She needs assistance." "Copy that, Officer Turner," the dispatcher replied, but there was a hint of disbelief in her tone, and I knew it. "Backup is en route." Minutes felt like hours as I waited, the darkness swallowing me whole. When my fellow officers arrived, they found nothing. I directed them to the spot where I'd seen her, but all that remained was the dark asphalt stretching into the night. They searched the area, calling her name, but the only response was the echo of our voices. "Mike, are you sure you saw something?" one of my partners, Officer Stevens, asked, concern etched across his face. I nodded vigorously. "I swear to you she was right here. Her face—" I trailed off, the memory of her haunting gaze flooding back. My colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. The unease in the air was palpable, the atmosphere thick with disbelief. "It's probably just a trick of the light, man. You've been out here too long," Stevens said, trying to reassure me. But I couldn't shake it. The image of her gaunt face was seared into my mind, and I felt the weight of something supernatural resting on my shoulders. As my fellow officers left, laughter and disbelief trailing behind them, I remained on the highway, staring into the abyss where she had stood. Weeks passed, but the memory haunted me. My colleagues began to tease me about the ghost on the highway. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease settled deeper within me. Every time I patrolled that stretch of road, I felt her presence lurking just beyond the beam of my headlights. One night, determined to confront my fears, I returned to that desolate stretch. I parked the cruiser, the engine's hum vibrating through the still air, and sat in silence waiting. The darkness wrapped around me, and I closed my eyes, willing her to appear. Minutes turned into hours. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it, a faint rustling, almost like a whisper. I opened my eyes, the darkness seeming to shift, and then I saw her. The woman in white stood a few yards away, her back still turned to me. "Ma'am?" I shouted, my heart racing again. "Please, turn around." Slowly, she began to turn. The familiar feeling of dread washed over me as her pale face emerged from the shadows. I could feel my sanity slipping as I stared into her hollow eyes, her mouth open in that silent scream, the rows of pointed teeth glistening in the moonlight. "Why are you haunting me?" I cried out, desperation clawing at my throat. Suddenly she lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. "Get away!" I shouted, panic rising within me. But just as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving only the cold wind whispering through the trees. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding wildly. It was as if she had left a piece of her darkness within me. The legend of the ghostly woman on the highway had claimed me as its own, and I knew I could never escape it. From that night on, the highway patrol became a nightly battle against my own fear. Each time I saw her, I felt a part of me slipping away, consumed by the mystery of the woman in white. And even as I continued to patrol those lonely roads, I could never shake the feeling that I was being watched, her hollow eyes following my every move, the weight of her silent scream echoing in my mind, reminding me that some encounters are not meant to be explained.